All right. Good afternoon. I'm glad to be here today, and I have this opportunity to talk about sawing techniques, and specifically this technique referred to as quarter sawing. And quarter sawing is a technique that I enjoy. I like the appearance of quarter sawn lumber. I like the benefit of the stability that you get with quarter sawn lumber. And we're going to look at 3 techniques for quarter sawing here today. As we go through this presentation, I want you to know that there's always exceptions. There's always an opportunity to do it a little bit differently. There's always an opportunity to employ some method that requires you to do it differently than is illustrated even in these illustrations. So we'll cover the most common techniques that people use to accomplish quarter sawing. And before we get into those techniques, what we really need to do, though, is define quarter sawing. A lot of times I'm asked, or I hear the question asked, what does it mean that a piece of wood or a log has been quarter sawn, or a piece of wood is quarter sawn versus flat sawn? So when we talk about quarter sawn lumber, we're talking about a piece of wood that has the growth ring coming up to the surface of the board no more than 10 degrees off of 90. So it can be 90 to 80 this way, 80 degrees this way, but no more than 10 degrees from 90. From 80 degrees on down to 45 degrees is what we call rift sawn. And then from 45 degrees on down is what they call flat sawn. So it really changes the appearance of the lumber when you move toward a quarter sawn board or a rift sawn board versus a flat sawn board. So you've got the growth ring coming up and meeting the surface at 90 degrees, no more than 10 degrees less than 90 either way. From 80 degrees on down to 45 degrees is going to be a rift sawn board, and from 45 degrees on down would be a flat sawn piece of lumber. So how do you go about positioning the log or making your cuts so that that growth ring, that annual growth ring, comes up and meets the surface of the board at 90 degrees? That's what we're going to explore. But to be fully quarter sawn, it must be between 90 and 80 degrees. And that's where you really get the difference in appearance in the lumber. One of the benefits of quarter sawn lumber, of course, is its stability, is its ability to stay flat. If you have a quarter sawn board that's 10, 11 inches wide, it won't cup on you. And my wife and I were out Christmas shopping 2 Christmases ago, and we were in a little shop in one of the malls. It was a temporary antique store set up in one of the malls. And as we were leaving, I looked down to see this cherry table that was sitting there, and it had what looked to be cigarette burns and everything all over. It was an old piece of furniture, but the closer I looked, the more I realized how special a piece of furniture it was. The top of this table was one piece, and then it had 2 leaves that folded up that were one piece, and it had all been quarter sawn, and it was as flat as it could be. It stayed nice and flat, and everything was nice and straight on it. And I left the store with that table, just not because I like the design of the table so much. I do like cherry wood, but to see that wide a board quarter sawn, they must have come out of really, really big logs. And I bought it for the wood more than I did as a piece of furniture. To see quarter sawn boards that wide was something you just don't see anymore. It takes longer to quarter saw, and there's a risk of a lower yield, but you aren't going to get 100% quarter sawn wood. You're going to get some rift sawn, and then you can have some flat sawn. In today's lumber business, In most cases, mills are looking for production. They're very production driven. So any sawing technique or any method that's going to slow them down is not going to be their method of choice. And unless you recognize a huge premium out of your lumber for quarter sawing, you're probably not going to do it in a large mill setting. But it does fit quite well in the small portable sawmill class, specifically, the Wood-Mizer mill. It makes sense to do some quarter sawing if that's what a customer might want, or if that's what you want, and it's relatively easy to do. There's 3 methods that we're going to talk about, but before we talk about those methods, we can talk about some benefits of quarter sawing. And I've already mentioned the shrinkage aspect of it. You will have different shrinkage. You won't necessarily have less shrinkage. You will have a different shrinkage. It'll shrink more in thickness. So typically you'll cut your quarter sawn lumber a tad thicker than you would flat sawn lumber. If you're wanting it to finish out to the same thickness as your flat sawn lumber, you would have to cut your quarter sawn a 1/16 or so thicker. So 1-inch lumber, I will always cut a little bit plump. Some of the other benefits of quarter sawing is, like I said, the appearance. There's a medullary ray in wood, and when you open that medullary ray in a quarter sawing fashion, it gives the wood a whole different appearance than it does than it has when it's flat sawn. Typically, a flat sawn board will have what they call a cathedral grain pattern. You won't see that in quarter sawn lumber. You'll either see a real straight grain pattern, or you'll see these fleck rays that get opened up because of the direction that you're sawing in relation to the growth ring. You'll open up these fleck rays, these medullary rays, and the lumber will take on a completely different look. So there's an appearance difference, there's a shrinkage difference, there's less likelihood of surface checking. It wears more evenly if it's used in a flooring or a stair tread type application. The wear characteristic is more even. If it's a quarter sawn surface, it tends to hold paint better and stain a little more evenly. It is not as much of a pronounced raised grain look. It's a smoother, flatter surface. And it's stronger in some properties also when it's quarter sawn, which makes sense if you take those growth rings and stack them going across the board. Just their orientation in a bending application, it's going to be much stronger if it's quarter sawn versus flat sawn. So we're going to talk about one method here, and we'll just refer to it as a general method. And as in any method you're going to use, log size is very important. Small logs, anything in the 16, 18 inch and under, that's borderline whether it's even big enough to even head toward quarter sawing it. The larger the better, really. I'd say a minimum would be this 17 to 18 inch size if you want to produce any width at all in quarter sawn lumber. And you'll see as we get into this method that you aren't going to get a lot of real wide material like you do when you flat saw. You're going to end up with narrower material. That's why it's important that your log diameter be in the 16, 18 inch range or on up. I wouldn't think of going much smaller than that. The other thing that really matters in the choice of a log to quarter saw is whether the heart is running straight through the piece or not, or whether it might be traversing through the piece. If you look at one end of the log, and on this end of the log the heart is in the center, and on this end of the log it's way down near the outside, it's traversing through the log, that's not a good candidate for quarter sawing. When you do quarter saw, you want to cut, when you split the log, you want to cut parallel with the heart. You always want to make your cuts parallel with the heart. So step one in this first technique of general quarter sawing is to start that log and hit it 1 or 2 inches above or 3 inches above the heart. Now that's a general rule. What you've got to be looking at when you make that cut is the angle of the growth ring. What defines quarter sawn wood? It's the growth ring meeting the surface at 90 degrees. No more than 10 either way. So wherever you make your cut, you need to be looking at the angle of the growth ring coming through the piece that you're generating. You can say cut 2 inches above the heart. You could say cut 3 inches above the heart. Really, the only way to know where to make that cut is to see what the angle of those growth rings are going to be meeting the surface of that board, to know whether you're going to get quarter sawn lumber or not. But this technique on a big round log, to start, here's your heart right in the middle, to start above the heart, say 2 cuts. We'll start 2 cuts above the heart, and we'll cut that log like we're going to have it. We'll take a big chunk right off of it. And we'll drop down, we'll make another cut. And those boards coming out of the center should give you the growth rings coming up and meeting the surface of the boards. All right? When it drops 10 degrees off of 90 or more, you're no longer quarter sawing, you're cutting rift sawn lumber. So where you make that cut in relationship to the heart is directly related to the angle of the growth rings. Now, what did I say about oval? Well, most logs are oval. They aren't round. And if you have a log that's oval, in other words, it's larger this way than it is this way, what are these growth rings doing on these flat sides of the oval? They're running straight for the longest distance, a longer distance than if that log was perfectly round. They come around the corner and they head up and they straighten out, then they turn again, kind of like the oval racetrack. There's longer straightaways. Well, in a log, if it's oval, there's longer annual growth rings, or their growth rings run straighter for a longer distance. So I like oval logs when I'm quarter sawing. So the idea is to get those boards out of the center that are going to be as close to quartered as you can get and as wide as you can possibly get them. And if you follow this sawing pattern, you'll see exactly what I mean. Now you remove the top part from the log and you set it aside, and you remove those boards that you already cut and you set them aside. And now you've got this fairly large portion of log setting at 90 degrees to the blade. We're up against our back supports and we've stood that up, and we're just going to cut down through it in this fashion here, like is illustrated. We're going to take that portion of log, and you'll see we'll end up with some quarter sawn boards over in this region right here. But I'll guarantee you by the time we get down into here, we're going to be rift, and then down into here, we're going to be crowding in on flat sawn. But these boards right here in this center section should be a quarter sawn, depending on that growth ring. Now, after we've cut those 2 halves, we put those boards back on that we cut earlier, and here's what we do to them. We can cut through the heart with this cut here, get the heart out of them. The heart's not nearly as stable. I'm not sure I would do them all, but 2 or 3 of them, get them up there, get that heart out of them, and then we're going to sand them up and edge them, and those are going to be probably our widest and best quarter sawn boards, these right here. Those came from these boards that we took out of the log in these cuts right here. See these? These are the boards now that we're edging right here. I have a little bit of trouble with edging quarter sawn lumber before it's dry. With quarter sawing, you will get more bow. So if there's tendency for it to continue to bow after you've sawn it, during the drying phase, if it's going to continue to bow, why straighten it more than once? I think that's a legitimate question, and I know that a lot of flitching is done in Europe. I think the Europeans do what they call a lot of flitch cutting. They flitch everything, stack it right back together, and they get a pretty good percentage of quarter sawn out of it, but they only straighten it once, and that's after it has done all its bowing or it's done its drying. That's when they straighten it. And I think that's a pretty good practice, because that way you're only straightening it once, and you should increase your yield. Now, this next technique that we want to talk about is called inside-out sawing, and I've used this a lot. It really produces a higher potential for a higher yield of quarter sawn lumber. And the first cut is simply splitting that log right in half. Now look it, I can tell you that if you're off an inch, let's say you've got a 10-foot log and you're quarter sawing that log. If it's the medular ray that you're looking for, those fleck rays like in the white oak, even red oak has it, sycamore is another one that you're looking for, that medullary ray. You're looking for those flecks, that different appearance that we talked about. You can see it in cherry, you can see it in maple, several other woods. You have to be parallel with the heart. I've proven to myself over and over, if I'm off as much as an inch in making this cut, splitting this log, if I'm off as much as an inch, the appearance of the lumber changes a lot. You get these cuts as parallel with the heart as you can get them, right on. Get them as close to parallel as the heart as you can possibly get them. Very, very important for getting that fleck ray appearance when you're quarter sawing. So we have split this log in half, and then we've quartered it. All right, we've got 4 quarters. Now here's one of them quarters sitting on the bed of the sawmill up against the back support, and you would make this first cut, but I'm going to tell you it's inevitable that this piece is going to bow when you go to quarter this log. So your first cut may be a truing cut on this cant, or you're going to have thin ends and a thick middle. So you've made this cut on the bottom, and you actually make them all from the bottom up. You make a cut, flip it, make a cut, flip it, and they all become cut from the bottom up. I've used this method a lot, and what you'll find you have to do when you get this piece right here on the sawmill bed, and the growth rings are starting to make this curvature around here, and they're beyond 10 degrees, it's pretty easy with this method to end up with a pretty high percentage of rift sawn lumber versus quartered. You'll have a lot of rift if you simply go make a cut, make a cut, make a cut, make a cut. What you may have to do, if your quarters are big enough, what I recommend you do, and you'll notice a big difference in the volume of quartered versus rift, you may have to make a truing cut. And what a truing cut will do, you'll have this quarter setting on the sawmill, and you'll make a cut, and now we're going to flip this like is illustrated. We may have to cock that up a little bit and change that angle so that that growth ring becomes 90 again. And you do throw away a piece shaped like a wedge. You take that piece off so that you can get your growth ring at 90 again. I have seen logs where you've got to make a truing cut every cut. They were perfectly round, the log was really round, and this angle of the growth ring is changing often enough that you have to make a trim cut every cut to get truly quarter sawn lumbered with this technique. So if you use this technique, be sure you're either cutting nice oval logs, or they're big enough so that your quarters stay with that growth ring at 90 more than one cut. Or you're going to be making a trim cut every cut. Does that make sense? You know what I mean? You would have to take that quarter and reposition it slightly so that your growth rings are now at 90. You may have to reposition it slightly, make a trim cut, and then take your board. It's a good method, and it works well, especially if the person that's using this lumber is happy with rift sawn as well as quartered. If you'll take the rift sawn along with the quartered, this works well. The third technique, and this is the one that I've kind of defaulted to through the years. I've used all three methods. This is the one here that you get about the widest quarter sawed material doing it this way. I know the percentage increases. The percentage of quarter sawn increases when you use this method. It can't be emphasized enough, with all of these methods, you're going to want to cut parallel with the heart, parallel with the pith. So in this one here, we do the same thing as we did in technique 2. We cut it into quarters, cut the log into quarters, and now watch how we treat these quarters. See what we're going to do to this quarter? We're going to put a flat side on the point so that when we turn it, we've got something to clamp against. We've rolled at 180 in this case. Now we'll put a flat side on that bottom. This is a small, this right here is where if you cut too deep on this cut or the last cut is where you're going to lose some yield. You have to be real careful because you're going to lose some board footage and quartered if you make these cuts too deep. Now watch what this quarter does. It stands up looking all kinds of weird. Got several different angles on it and so forth, but think about this in relationship to these annual growth rings. See where they are? Now it almost looks, they're coming right straight through this piece for the most part. Now we're going to cut this like this, and yeah, you have this tapered edge here that you got to deal with later on after it's dry. Then when we re-straighten it, we re-square these edges. But see, this technique will take you toward the highest percentage of quarter sawn out of a log. And when you get an oval log, these quarters here just can produce, I've had 4 or 5 cuts right in a row of nicely quarter sawn lumber without correcting the piece to get that angle back, especially when a log's oval. You'll get the highest percentage of quartered along with a good percentage of rift and almost no flat. So you saw this cant halfway down, flip it, cut it the rest of the way down to the bed. And you do that for all 3 cants. But I can tell you there's no hard and fast method that applies to every log where you can quarter saw this log. Quarter sawing involves manipulating during the sawing process to get that growth ring perpendicular to the surface of the board. And if you have to sacrifice some wood to get it, if you want quarter sawn lumber and you have a buyer for quarter sawn lumber and that's what they want, then you got to do it. You may have to throw away some to get what you want. And that's why it demands a higher price, and it brings it. Over the last 4 to 5 years, when we go to shows, I've pretty much gone toward quarter sawing all of our oak. Well, it makes the log last longer at the shows, but it also gives the lumber a completely different appearance. And it gives us the opportunity to explain how to quarter saw. It's not really a lost art. You're starting to see it come back, but it's very beneficial in door frames. Anything where you want stability, the lumber to be stable. We've gone toward a lot of laminates and core products that we're veneering over to get stability. You can accomplish the same stability with proper quarter sawing and drying techniques. You can get very stable wood as a solid. And appearance-wise, you just got to like it. in order to pay more for it. If it's not something you like, you're probably not as likely to pay more money for it. But those seeking it for its stability and its appearance will pay more money for it because there aren't a lot of people doing it. And it's a fun sawing technique on the Wood-Mizer mill. They're very good. It's a very good mill to quarter on. You're going to make more cuts, so your kerf savings comes into play. You save on your kerf. There's been a lot of times when we've had to have the logs before they go on the sawmill bed. If you get logs that are over capacity, they're bigger than 36 inches, and you can have them with a chainsaw, that gets you going. If you can just have it, you can get the quartering done on the mill on those capacity logs. But we've cut a lot of them in half with a chainsaw and started there. And I would prefer those, even though we have to cut them in half with a chainsaw, I'd still prefer those big logs for quarter sawing. The results just seem to be a lot better if you're into big wood. You can't take a lot of bow on a 6-inch board before it becomes a 3-inch board. So the fact that you do have a little more bow, the larger logs compensate for it very nicely. So if there's not any questions, or if there are any questions, we can entertain some questions now. If not, that's how to quarter saw. I thank you for giving us the opportunity to present this it's not a lost art, but it's not being done very much, and I think it gives a Wood-Mizer owner a little bit of an opportunity here to seize on something that may be very marketable, getting back into quarter sawing. Thank you.